I don't think at this point in time there's a significant amount of research that would say that we have a completely evidence-based approach to therapy. And I think the reason why not is because most people who have been doing attachment therapy are therapists and clinicians and not researchers. And I think in most fields, the practitioners and the practice has led research after enough work is being done so that the research can examine what is being done. It would be pretty hard to have research on something if there wasn't a practice model or practice models that were ongoing so that there'd be enough clients to look at. And I think evidence-based, that language right now is quite trendy, and certainly there are people who wouldn't think that that's the most expeditious and the simplest way to go, including people like Bessel van der Kolk, who often refers to evidence-based therapy with some disdain, I suppose. Yeah, I think we're seeing, especially if you embrace the information being talked about in terms of a developmental trauma disorder, or complex trauma, we see that the kids we're talking about have multiple levels of trauma, multiple and sequential and simultaneous traumatic events going on. And so I think it's going to be very complex to ferret out all of the specific details for a specific kind of child's trauma and to match that with a specific treatment intervention. I think it has to be individually tailored and developed for each particular child. There are kids who have sad responses to their trauma. There are kids who have angry responses to their trauma. There are kids that are fearful based on their trauma. And I think we have to have an understanding of that context before we can just say we're going to do A, B, and C. And I think there are many children who are being misdiagnosed today, particularly with, I think, most often the inappropriate diagnosis of bipolar disorder for every child who has any kind of dysregulation or any kind of regulatory disorder. And that diagnosis was never really intended for children and adolescents. But then that particular diagnosis leads us into needing to have a medication regimen to do that treatment, which those medications haven't been approved for use in children and adolescents, and brings on a whole other set of physiological difficulties. So I think we need to get somewhat back to the basics of seeing what trauma has occurred and the child's response to that trauma and the child's subjective interpretation of that trauma, and not the clinician or the parent's interpretation of the trauma, because some kids have had traumatic events to which they have not had a traumatic response yet. They may later on, but what seems traumatic to me, the child may have somehow managed or mastered and accommodated to, and it may not be, their responses may not be in response to what I perceive their trauma to be.
What is developmental trauma disorder?
The developmental trauma disorder is a new disorder, a diagnosis proposed by Dr. Bessel van der Kolk. And it is a diagnosis that seeks to capture the range of impact that we see with children that have had complex trauma in their lives. And so it focuses not just on the behavior of children, but looks at things like affect regulation, the way that children think in a distorted way, how their sense of self is damaged, how they can be dissociative, and how they can have really severe problems with attachment. Well, as you see, the breadth of these problems overlap with a lot of different possible diagnoses. And so what's happened is children with attachment-related difficulties and trauma have tended to collect a range of diagnoses like attention deficit disorder, bipolar disorder, other disruptive behavior disorders. And the problem is that those disorders never capture the underlying problem, that they are simply behavioral. And so when children collect that list of diagnoses, the real problem is never addressed and therefore never solved. Treatment that focuses on healing children that have had attachment-related traumas needs to include several key components. Probably the most important of that is affect regulation, helping them to learn about their feelings and how to manage their feelings. Another is to deal with the very distorted beliefs that they've developed about themselves, about other people, and about how the world works. Another area is teaching children what is called, excuse me, prosocial behaviors that teach them about how to repair relationships, how to demonstrate empathy, because that actually is a teachable skill. Therapy to address the problems of attachment and attachment-related trauma need to include several key ingredients. One of them is affect regulation, which simply means teaching children about their feelings and how to manage their feelings. A second key component is to address distorted beliefs that children have developed out of the experiences that they've had, experiences or beliefs about themselves, about other people, and about how the world works. And probably the third component is the teaching of what we would call pro-social skills, knowing how to build relationships, how to repair relationships, how to demonstrate empathy, because that is a teachable skill.